was difficult start. Would you like me to go ahead and make the introduction, or would you like to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, you want us to go ahead? All right. Rabbi Rafi, do you want me to begin? Like, tell me.
Oh, yeah. Gary, it's all you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Sorry for the delay in the start. This morning we have the third in our series of programs on religion and state in Israel, bringing the Masorti movement to Congregation Agudah Hakim. This program comes to you along with the other programs with generous support from the Educational Endowment Fund and Congregation Agudah Hakim. Today's discussion will be led by Rabbi Mikey Goldstein of the Congregation Adat Shalom Emanuel, and we're going to post it by Zidon. I'll let the speakers correct the pronunciation if they need to. We didn't have time to say it ahead of the meeting. They'll be speaking about LGBTQ rights in the state of Israel, and I think considering the delay, why don't we just go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Gary. I am the board member that I've been with you the last with this last third meeting that we've had with us all team members and with the Jewish March. I hope a couple other people will join us because we're excited to share with you this topic with this blog with Dr. Chim. And
I think we should just go ahead. I mean, there's a danger that some people left while we were waiting, and I'm very sorry about that. But I don't think think it helps to wait more.
So, what we're going to do is I want to tell you a bit about our distinguished guest with us, and I'm going to ask questions just so we hold it as a conversation. But please feel free to ask your own questions. It can be through the chat, or you can sort of raise your hands because we're going to be, I don't think we'll be an intimate group and we can have a discussion here about the behind you. Rabbi Andy Sachs, we started it off our series talking about religion and state in Israel in the broader sense. And then the last time we met, we talked about the Kotel and the public sphere and how does that relate to religion and state. And today we're going to focus on another subject, which is also one of the subjects that religion and state comes into hand, and that is the whole issue and challenges of the LGBTQ community in Israel. So I'll start by introducing our speakers. Rabbi Mikey Goldstein is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary from 2014, and he's the leading rabbi of Adat Shalom Emanuel, which is our Masorti synagogue in Rehovot. He's also the president of the Rabbinical Assembly in Israel. I'll just say that Rabbi Mikey has a beautiful British accent, because he grew up in a religious Zionist family in the United Kingdom, and he has a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Manchester. And he worked for many years in the world of social change and in the field of advocacy for Israel, and volunteered for many, many years in Jerusalem in the Open House for Pride and Tolerance, and served as the chairman of, and I think still serves, or served as, not yet, but served for quite a while as the chairman of the Open House, the Beit HaPatuach. And Mayan, who is the rabbinical student in Adat Shalom Emanuel's with Rabbi Mikey, is also a graduate of Middle Eastern Studies. I don't know if you both knew that about yourself, from Yale University. She grew up in Hyde Park, New York, and is studying currently in the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem to become a rabbi. And she's moved to Israel in 2016, working in with Jewish young adults visiting in Israel in education and long-term educational programs. And I'll just add that we're in Israel under strict lockdown, so every one of us is speaking all from their homes. I actually sneaked into the office because it's very close to my home in Jerusalem. And we're very excited to be with you today. I'll start off with asking Rabbi Goldstein and then Mayan, if you can share a bit of who you are and your personal story and how that connects to the topic that we're going to discuss today.
Thank you, Devorah, and thank you to Agudah Hakim for having us today and for having this program all together. first of all, you can call me Mikey. I'm not your rabbi, so I don't need to worry about how you address me. My first name is fine, thank you. So I grew up, as Dvorah mentioned, in a religious Zionist home back in Liverpool, in England. I grew up, if any of you know the B'nai Akiva youth movement, which is religious Zionist youth movement. We were what we'd call a modern Orthodox family. And I went to a more religious school, one that didn't like me going to a group that had boys and girls mixing together. So I sort of grew up in different parts of the Orthodox world. But from an early age, I understood about myself that I was different to my friends who were interested, the boys going out with girls, the girls going out with boys, and I was more interested in the boys. But back in the 70s and then the 80s, there wasn't anything really much I could do with that. There was no place for me to go and speak to other Jewish people about being gay. Luckily, though, growing up in England, as opposed to if I would have been in Israel at the same time, England was perhaps a few years behind the States, but it was obviously much more open than Israel was and in those times, in the 70s and the 80s. And my dad had someone who worked for him who was gay, and whilst type of wasn't particularly celebrated, but it wasn't a big issue. It wasn't like he's weird or anything like that. And already late 70s, early 80s, there was stuff on TV where gay or lesbian characters were in more positive light than perhaps had been in the past. And so I grew up in surroundings that weren't a place for a nice Jewish boy to come out in, but also, you know, I didn't grow up with like people saying terrible things, most of the time at least, about gay people. But still, it's like sexual identity and gender identity, these are major parts of who we are. And if at an early age we can't talk about them or discuss them even, never mind come out or anything like that, it has its toll. I came to Israel first for a longer period after I finished high school in 82. I came here for 2 years. I did the army as well. I was studied for a year at a modern Orthodox yeshiva where they do army as well, a Hesder yeshiva. And then I went off to the army, and then I went back to Britain to study at university. And until then, I'd been very much in the Jewish bubble. I went to Jewish school. I went to Jewish youth movement. My home was like within 3 minutes walk of all the Jewish stuff that one might need in Liverpool. And then at university, I was suddenly thrown into a much bigger arena. And I don't know how it is exactly on US campuses, but on all British campuses, there's the student union, which supports all sorts of social activities and political activities for the students. And what was very interesting there was a Jewish society, which was obviously a place that I got involved in, to mix with other Jewish students and have programming about Judaism, about Israel. And there was also a GLBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender society that I kept away from because I was still pretty much in the Jewish bubble nevertheless. But the notice boards of the two societies and in the student union were very close. From G to J is not very far. And I would stand and look at the Jewish Society notice board and squint towards the GLBT notice board, at least to know what was going on, not necessarily I didn't go to any activities in the years that I was at university. And it wasn't until I actually made Aliyah in 1989 that I was able to find the courage to actually start to come out. Until then, it was like, okay, you've met this nice girl, that nice girl, why don't you go out with somebody? And the pressure, you know, I was 23, 24 already, about 24 when I came on Aliyah, and it's like, you know, in the modern Orthodox world, it's like, you know, should be thinking about getting married already. And when I came to on Aliyah, I came to Jerusalem, and for the first time I met other Jewish gay people, which was like amazing because there were all sorts of people. First of all, you know, Israel, if you're going to meet a gay person, the likelihood is that they're going to be Jewish. But I met people who would do Friday night dinner together, and people who would go to a Reform shul together, and then I actually met someone from my old yeshiva, who neither of us knew about the other until we met years later. And then suddenly I was able to find a place where I could start to come out, where I could meet people who were normal people, people who were similar to me, and not worry about it this being this weird thing. And so I started, once I moved to this long coming out period, that I still had a problem telling my parents, because it's like one of the problems that people have when coming out is that they're breaking certain people's dreams. Our parents dream of our wedding day. Our parents dream of the grandchildren they're going to have, and the pretty house that they know you're going to live in, and all that type of thing. And my dreams were different to my parents, and suddenly I had to be able to tell them that they're going to have to change their dreams for me, which is not always an easy thing to do. And it took me time, because they were still living in England at the time, and I was living here. It took 5 years till I was able to come out to them. In between, I'd come out to my sister here. And in that, so I'm talking about the early 90s here, and big changes were actually happening in Israel at the time. And it was like, coming out wasn't just the fact that I needed to come out to my family eventually, but it was also the fact that the society was changing here in Israel and being a bit more open to LGBT people, and meaning that I would be able to have, hopefully, a relationship and live with somebody, and that would not be a problem for the society, not just for my family. And luckily, my parents brought me up in a loving home, and they were able in time to deal with me coming out, etc. And at the end of the day, what I learned from this whole process is that whilst certain changes happen in society and on a political level and on a societal level, the real change happens at home. The real change happens on a one-to-one basis. The real change is what each and one of us does. It's not those big, the people who like to get up and speak and be in public. It's the small people, the regular people, who are the real heroes of making change, because just by coming out to our families and by being there, and perhaps coming home with the boyfriend or the girlfriend, whatever it might be, and just being there, it helps change society in a much more realistic way than someone saying that, you know, you should treat people this way, that way, in a better way. And but there were still barriers, and my big barrier was when I decided that I'd like to be a rabbi, which was later on in my life. In 2009, basically, I came to that understanding, and still here in Israel, whilst the conservative movement had already made its changes in the States and in other places, in Israel, it was still not accepting. The Shechter Rabbinical Institute was not accepting gays and lesbians. And so it was, again, like, you know, I thought I'd found a home. I was working actually at that time for the Masorti movement in the offices in Jerusalem. But I couldn't go to rabbinical school. And in some ways, it made my life a bit easier. Like, not being a rabbi has its pluses. But it was something that I wanted to do. And in Israel, the only possibility of doing that was at the time to go to Hebrew Union College of the Reform movement, which is not what I wanted to do. Luckily from JTS, they reached out to me, and I was able to spend 4 years in New York studying there. And by the time I came back, the Schechter Rabbinical School had been forced to change its policy by public opinion, conservative Judaism public opinion. And if we look at around today, whilst if you go to your regular Orthodox yeshiva or whatever, a gay person to be accepted at a rabbinical school is very unlikely, but there is the Hartman Institute that runs a rabbinical program, and the Hartman Institute is an Orthodox organization that does accept gays and lesbians to its program. So things are changing here in Israel, perhaps differently to how they're changing in the States, but I'm very lucky to have seen a lot of change in my time and to have been involved through the Jerusalem Open House in bringing about some of that change. I think that's a good place to stop for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Mikey. And I think sharing with us such a personal and it's quite a journey that you've come and you're still on. And thank you for sharing that with the group, because it's very personal stuff. Mayan, please share with us who you are and how did you come to be connected to this topic? What's your relationship with it?
So one of the key points of my relationship is that I am now one of the gay and lesbian rabbinical students that are now studying at Schechter Institutes in Jerusalem. Other than that, my story begins not in jolly old England, but I usually introduce myself as being from upstate New York. But in this particular crowd, there might be people who would object to Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie being considered upstate. Your mileage may vary. But so I did not grow up Jewish. I grew up in the Catholic education system. And so my coming to terms with my identity as a lesbian started far before I was sort of trying to struggle to integrate that with Judaism or Israel. It was one of the main things that pushed me away from the Catholicism that I was raised in. Was in Catholicism, a lot of times people Jewish people don't even necessarily don't believe me even necessarily when I say, in Judaism, every text study can start with a question, with a what do you think? Where does this meet you? And what does this say to you? Whereas in the education that I grew up in, there's one answer to every question of faith and morals, and it's contained in one 900-page beige book. And, if you don't find yourself within that 900-page book, sorry, and get with the program or get out. So I got out. And I ended up sort of finding Judaism through my desire to find a deeply rooted faith that would allow me to experience spirituality and also be my full self at the same time. And I really, really found that home in the conservative Judaism of the United States. And I might have stayed there for a long time in the American conservative Jewish world, were it not for the fact that I fell in love with an Israeli. And so in 2016, I made Aliyah. A few weeks after I made Aliyah, there was the Jerusalem Pride Parade that I marched in for the first time. I was living in Jerusalem at the time. I now live in Rishon LeZion. And as I was sitting and I was thinking, okay, what's, if you're not familiar, the Jerusalem Pride and Tel Aviv Pride are the two biggest sort of pride events in Israel, but they have very different characters. Tel Aviv Pride is very much a party in the streets, celebration, and both are very exciting, and I recommend that you go sometime when there's not a global pandemic. But Jerusalem Pride is much more of a protest. It's you can feel it in the way that there's security guards everywhere. This was a few years after Shira Bonke was killed by an ultra-Orthodox extremist. I think it was 2 years after she was killed. At the Jerusalem Pride Parade. And as I was sitting thinking, like, what do I want to write on my sign to carry at the parade, I thought, as a new Ola, I have so many rights, and the state of Israel embraces me in so many ways. They've funded my master's program at Schechter. They gave me free intensive Hebrew classes that helped me end up finding a job and being able to integrate into society. They gave me cash when I arrived at the airport and like a stipend to help me get through the first few months. There's so many things that I received, but there was just that one set of rights that I felt like were taken away. And just the right to get married, and the right to, it's not the only important right, I think, like in the LGBT world, but it is a hugely symbolic one. And my now wife and I, we were married about 1.5 years ago, and we did 2 weddings. We had one wedding in upstate New York. Sorry, upstate. I don't know how else to describe it. Outside Hyde Park, Statsburg. And which happened to work out for us because I had family there that wouldn't be able to travel to the Israel wedding anyway. For most Israelis, it's a much bigger inconvenience to have a wedding abroad in order to have their marriage recognized in Israel. But I remember when we walked in the US to the town of Clinton clerk's office to register our marriage certificate, and I was like, wow, the clerk does not really know what she's in for today, to have these 2 Jewish lesbians from Israel coming in was probably not an everyday occurrence for her. But I just felt so reassured thinking to myself, you know what, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she likes us. It doesn't matter what she thinks about Israel. It doesn't matter what she thinks about Jews. It doesn't matter what she thinks about the way we're going to get married. It doesn't matter that we're lesbians, because here we have legal rights. There's the law backs us up, and so in Israel, far more depends on policies. We hear all the time about, here and there you have, oh, there's another big win for the adoption. For the first time, they've recognized the right to so-and-so to so-and-so. But so many of those things are just, they happen here and there, and it's not systematic legal protections, like the LGBT community has in the state of New York. So that's where I am now. Now we're married. I'm actually still waiting on the apostille for like the international notary coronavirus kind of threw off those plans for me to get that. So I'm not technically legally married in the state of Israel yet, despite having had a big, beautiful Masorti wedding here. But so that's where I find myself in Israel. Like the whole LGBT issue is, there's been incredible strides made by people who fought incredibly hard for them. But at the same time, it's kind of a tenuous situation because there's so much that's not protection that isn't set in stone.
So thank you, Marianne. That sort of brings me to my next question, which is, the personal gets so involved with the public, and what happens to us in our home is so influenced by the law of the land. And Rabbi Mikey, I have to call you Rabbi because I see you as a rabbi and you're a rabbi here. If you can tell us, and Marianne add, feel free to add to what Rabbi Mikey says, a bit of the history of how did we get to where we are today, and what are like the main landmarks in the struggle of the gay community in Israel to be recognized. If you can tell us a bit about that. Thank you. You're muted.
I'm very rarely on mute because I'm only leading programming, so it happens. So I'll talk a little bit about legislation and in Israel. So Israel received a lot of British laws because of the British mandate beforehand. And one of the wonderful laws that Israel took from the Brits was the sodomy law, which basically meant that any homosexual sexual actions were illegal. And this was typical in many Western states, in Europe and in the States until more recently. And what happened in the 60s, they basically decided, the courts decided that they're not going to implement this law anymore. It only got repealed in the 70s, but it wasn't until 1992 that there was any positive LGBT legislation. And that was a law that had been passed a few years beforehand about equality of rights for all people. It doesn't matter, based on everyone is equal, doesn't matter what religion they are, what color they are, etc. So in 1992, they also added sexual identity to that. So that it meant from 1992, people who are LGBTQ or just different could not be, there was nothing people could do against them just based on the fact that they were LGBTQ. That was the opening of things. Until then, the LGBT organization of Israel, the Aguda, until then it kept itself under wraps, and it wasn't a well-known organization and it also couldn't call itself the LGBT organization. It was the Association for Personal Rights, or something to that effect in English. But from 1992, they started to have pride events, right? Something that had been happening in New York since 1970. Only in 1992 did Israel in Tel Aviv have its first pride event, not yet a march. Within a few years, people were marching in Tel Aviv, and we already heard from Marianne that now it's a big, except for obviously this last year, it's a big celebration. Up to 1 million people take part in Tel Aviv Pride. And that's when things started to change. I was married for 25 years to an Israeli diplomat, and I traveled with him to various places around the world. And we left Israel in 1995 after having just been recognized as a couple by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we were actually the first couple to be recognized as a couple and to go abroad. and I was given the rights of a spouse of a diplomat, which meant that I got my ticket paid for, and I got a diplomatic passport, and all those type of things. And that was based on the 1992 inclusion of LGBT people in the law of discrimination. What was interesting though, and is interesting until today, there's been very little pro-LGBT legislation. Legislation has always been held up in the Knesset. And as you can well imagine, it's been mainly the ultra-Orthodox, but sometimes the modern Orthodox parties that have stopped LGBT legislation going forward. On the other hand, the courts, and especially the High Court, are very sympathetic to the LGBT community. So when anything goes to court, for example, there were couples who gay or lesbian couples, one of them passed away, and the other one, quite rightly, should receive the inheritance. But because they weren't married, because they couldn't get married, there was no way to show, legally at the time that the living spouse should receive the inheritance. And so there were a number of court cases in this area. And it was only basically in the High Court, type of going to different levels of the court, but eventually reaching the High Court, where the decision was made that yes, there should be inheritance rights for spouses from gay and lesbian couples. There were other things that again went to court. I, for many years, was involved with the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance, the LGBT community center in Jerusalem. Each year when we wanted to march we started marching in 2002 in Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken. And every year that we wanted to march, the first few years, we had to go to court to be able to march. And then we had to go to court to get the city to put out the flags along the route. We had to go to court to get the city to give us some funding, as the city hands out funding to various nonprofits. And it's all based on they put out what are the criteria for receiving funding. Theoretically, the open house should receive based on the criteria, and then for some reason wouldn't get, and so we would go to court to get the funding from the city for different things. Everything had to go to court. Even today, the legislation is not happening. For example, there was a move to allow gay couples, specifically men here, to have rights for surrogacy here in Israel. Surrogacy hardly happens here in Israel for straight couples, but gay couples are completely not allowed by law to take on a surrogate here to have their child. And which means they have to go abroad if that's the route they want to go down. And that becomes very, very expensive. Plus the fact that you should be able to do everything at home. If like surrogacy is allowed for straight couples here, then it should be allowed for gay couples. And the Likud even has a gay minister. He's now minister for the police and in interior security, internal security. And at the time, he said, yes, the Likud will back this law. But at the end of the day, his own party didn't back the law because of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And so any legislation just has great difficulties in going through. But when polls are done, asking people what do they think about the LGBTQ community, should they be given equal rights and things like that, actually that goes together with also giving the different streams of Judaism, us and Reform rights in Israel, then people are much more and more open to the changes that should take place, whereas in the Knesset it's just not happening because of the way the political system is built. And so there have been a lot of good court cases that have brought rights, including the right for our marriages from abroad to be recognized here. This is just an interesting fact. if any couple who gets married abroad, outside of Israel, theoretically, their marriage is only recognized for registration purposes. If a couple are married in the States, not in an Orthodox wedding, but only have something from the city hall or whatever, that they got married there, or they got married with a non-Orthodox rabbi, then they will be registered here as married. But the rabbinate that is responsible for weddings will not count that as a real wedding. But under that same ruling, gay couples are now recognized as well. So it's interesting. It's de facto, but not de jure, the recognition of weddings from abroad. So it's a plus, but then why do I have to go abroad? Why did Maayan have to go abroad to get married? This is ridiculous. It's like, in her case, it's different. She has family in the States. But like for your typical gay and lesbian Israeli couple, it's like they can't afford this expense of going abroad. And it's not every country that will marry gay people anyway. And so it becomes very complicated. And just the most simple, basic right of deciding who you can live with and being able to be certain that having gotten married, the two spouses can look after each other. It's like, God forbid, one spouse gets ill and the other one needs to make a decision for them. If their union is not recognized, then suddenly the family can swoop in and make different decisions to what this couple, who have already discussed after living together for 15, 20 years, they discussed what they want to do for medical situations such as this. And all of a sudden, someone else can come in and make a decision. So whilst we're moving ahead in some ways, in other ways, there's still a long way to go. And one other area, which isn't quite in the judicial area, but they love us in the army. Everybody goes to the army, or most people go to the army when they're 18, and because you're not allowed to discriminate, so the army is not allowed to discriminate. And when that law was brought in, it also brought a change, took a few years, but brought along a change in the army. So you might not want to be out in every part of the army, but it's much easier now for young people in Israel in general to be out, and therefore to live a life that is open. And because one of the problems of being in the closet is that you learn to lie, you learn to cover up things. It's just not healthy psychologically, and that can have an effect on some people. That has an effect that is actually physical as well. Thank God I got through that part of my life okay, but some people it leads to very dangerous health situations. And so it's really good that the army is open, still has work to do, but it's on the way.
Thank you, Rabbi Mikey. Maayan, I'm sure you have your thoughts on this subject of also the history, but also maybe you can add some of the what you see as the main challenges today that face the community, and specifically when it comes to religion and state.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I do want to say is, just to underline what Mikey you already brought up, is the tremendous support that there is among many places. Like when you go to TLV Pride, you think, wow, Israel just absolutely 100% supports us, amazing. But I think that almost as a response to that overwhelming acceptance in certain circles, the more visible the community becomes, the more backlash I think there is from the hard right Orthodox perspective. And I remember what I think it was the biggest protest for LGBT rights in Israel's history, for sure. The LGBT strike in 2018. There was like a general strike day for LGBT workers, which ended with a with a huge atzelet gathering in Kikar Rabin, in one of the central squares of Tel Aviv, where about 100,000 people came. Many famous people came, performed, artists performed, and I was there, and it was on Tisha B'Av, and I remember looking around and feeling like I was maybe the only person in the crowd that was both fasting for Tisha B'Av and at the pro. I'm sure there were other people, but I felt very much like I was the only person that I saw who was both fasting for Tisha B'Av and protesting for LGBT rights, which I think sort of speaks to how thoroughly divided the religious public is from the Tel Avivi public in general. The Tel Avivi public being the mostly Chinoni, secular. The secular religious divide is on a social level extremely strong. And I think that's and as someone who straddles that divide in a lot of ways, my wife is secular, and I am religious, but a lot of religious people in Israel don't think that I'm religious. They're like, oh, you're that kind of religious, not datiya. So in my opinion, what needs to happen before there will be kind of like the big sweeping change on the state level, hopefully, again, rights, like a solid civil marriage, like full equality in front of the law, I think is the long-term goal. But I see the fight as if we just started fighting for that, I don't know if we would get anywhere. We need to fight to dispel all of the homophobia, the transphobia that's so prevalent in so many parts of Israeli society, and we can only do that by also breaking down the divide between secular and religious.
Thank you. So and I know we started late, we're soon coming up to spending an hour together. And I am curious to hear from both of you, a vision that you have for the future and how this change will happen. And also, how does you see this relevant to our friends in the around the world, Jews around the world, and Masorti congregations in the States? If you can elaborate that. And I'll say to you that Israel is going to its fourth election. Which is sort of embarrassing to admit here, but you all know about it. But there is talk saying that the LGBTQ fight that is, like you said, pretty popular amongst Israeli public might be the window to change all relations of religion and state. That once, that will be the window for civil marriage in Israel. Or the door to open up for civil marriage in Israel. And that we have two ministers, not one, but two ministers in the government today that are part of the community and have a family and are married, shows that maybe, some of this movement that the Messiah is not going to come from the conservative or the reform movement, but actually from the LGBTQ community, changing state and religion. So I'm curious to hear if you share that vision, or what is your vision, and of course, how's it connecting to our friends here with us? So Rabbi Mikey, please.
Well, I'm an optimist, and that has led me to the path where I am today, and to become a rabbi. But in this area, I'm not yet an optimist about changes of state and religion here in Israel. I say that I'm just thinking of my own shul. In two and a half years ago in Rehovot, we had our first Pride march. Until then, it'd been obviously Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Haifa and a few other places, Beersheba, and now many towns have their own Pride march at some point during the summer, and one of the co-presidents of the shul suggested at a board meeting that we should arrange to march together, get a banner for the shul and march together. It was obvious that I was going to be taking part. I actually spoke there. And one of the board members said, I don't think it's a good idea that we should march under the banner of the shul. And, I'm in the room there, I'm keeping quiet. It's like, it was a bit weird. And so they asked him why. Well, we don't want our shul to be known as the gay shul. Which I don't think it is, but I do want it to be known as a shul where LGBTQ people can come to, just as all sorts of other people can come to. Just as I don't like to be known as the gay rabbi, I'm a rabbi who is gay. And when the shul took me on in 2014, I was the first conservative rabbi to be appointed to work in a shul here in Israel, the first gay rabbi from the conservative movement. And the shul were very proud of that. But it turns out that one or two people, or perhaps a few more of the congregants as well, but a couple of people on the board think that, okay, but like that's, we don't want to make it bigger than it already is. We don't want people to think that that's all we're about. We came to a compromise, which I worked at behind the scenes, and we did march, but under a banner from the movement. But I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just in what we would call the typical areas of the Orthodox and the far right, but also in the periphery. When I say periphery, I mean anything outside of Greater Tel Aviv. To a certain extent, even in Jerusalem becomes the periphery here. There are certain areas where it's okay to be gay. You can walk around with your, a couple who are both male, both female, transgender people to a lesser extent will be accepted as well. But there's many parts of Israel which we'll call the periphery, even though they might be in the center of the country, where it's much more difficult for gay people. And there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Mayan talked a little bit about that as well. And the Knesset is far behind where the people are. The people are in a better place than they were, but they're still in that place where it's difficult to talk about these things, or it's like, as long as you keep it quiet, then it's okay. And we need to change that. Here in Rehovot, there's a youth movement for gay kids. It's basically a place for them to go, say when they're 15, 16, 17, to meet as a group and to be able to discuss their issues as they have. Do they want to come out in school? What does it mean when they have to go off to the army, and if they need to come out, and how can they deal with this with their parents? And this youth group works all over the country. And here in Rehovot, for example, we have the city coalition is led by Likud, but the actual mayor is originally from the Shas, ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party. And he has ensured that there has been no funding for this group over the years since he's been the mayor. He's now been forced into giving some form of funding. But these are the type of things that we're up against. Rehovot is in the center of the country. It's 150,000 people live here. It's not a little place by Israeli standards, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So I don't know if this is going to push things. Where, on the other hand, the LGBTQ population has people in high places, but then this minister from the Likud does not help us. He claims to help, but he doesn't. That's my personal opinion, obviously. Some people think that the LGBT community should work with him. I think there's just no point, because all he's interested in, my opinion, is his seat at the government table. And it's really, I believe it's a grassroots change that needs to take place in religion and state as well. It needs for the people to demand of its politicians that they stop not allowing more progressive ideas to come into the Knesset. And the problem is that politicians here are not answerable directly to, they don't have constituents. They're elected on a party. The whole country is one big constituency, and each party gets a percentage of the seats according to the percentage of the vote. So there's no real answerability, if you like, to the public. And I think that's the big problem. Until that changes, I think it'll be very difficult to make other changes. But I am optimistic.
Thank you, Rabbi Mikey. Mayan?
Optimistic, but not too much. I would agree with that. I think there in LGBT advocacy in general, I would say, this is a generalization, so I say it tentatively, I think that there are two major sort of pushes and types of LGBT advocacy around the world. One focuses a lot on family and parental and relationship rights, and like everything we were talking about with marriage and adoption and surrogacy, which tend to be very high profile cases, and they do very, very much impact day-to-day life for a lot of people. But then there's also the side of LGBT phobia, that also I think sometimes we can do a bit of a disservice by not focusing more on that as focused as we are on the two beautiful dads, they want a baby. Yes, they should have equal rights to have a baby, but on the other hand, like we also need to look at the unemployment rate among trans people. There's no legal protections for trans people in the workplace in Israel. The unemployment rate is skyrocketing. Queer homeless youth, the just general lack of funding in periphery, lack of awareness, lack of sensitivity on a person-to-person issue, especially in schools, like nationwide. I think there's especially, I won't say especially in the periphery, because I've also for a while I was working at a shul in the center of Tel Aviv, and we also ran into these issues. So it's not just in the periphery, as much as people would like to think, that people within Tel Aviv would like to think that it is. And so I guess and I understand that the US has plenty of problems of its own, and you don't necessarily need to take on all of our struggles as your struggles, but insofar as you're all, like, as American Jews, engaged and care about Israeli society, I just hope that you will ask questions and continue to learn about issues like this, and learn more and be engaged with the day-to-day struggles of LGBT people in Israel. And as much as you can, American Jewry does, I think, have a big voice. As much as it cannot feel like American Jewry doesn't have much of a say when we talk about the Kotel and things like that, I do think that the force of public opinion in the Jewish world does make a difference in Israeli society. So keep learning, keep talking to us. I mean, specifically to Mikey and I, that would be great, but just to the LGBT Jews of Israel, and stay in touch, and we hope that we can count on you to be on our side when it matters.
I'd like to add one thing to that. It's going out on a limb a little bit, but conservative Jews are well known for supporting financially all sorts of organizations, including in Israel. And what I would suggest is that when supporting an organization in Israel, which is a very good thing to do, and I'm all for it, but to ask that organization these type of questions: where are you on state and religion? Where are you on LGBTQ rights? Where are you on rights for conservative and reform Jews? Even if it's not part of your decision whether to give the money or not, but be in conversation with these people who might not normally be asked these questions. And that can make a difference to us here by asking those Israelis who you're helping and showing that this is a concern of yours. And it just helps bring these subjects into a larger light here in Israel amongst Israelis, and get them to talk about it a bit more, because I think we're certainly in the right direction, but I think a lot of people need a bit of a push to get there, and to understand that at the end of the day we're talking about people, and all people, as we know, are in God's image. And whilst we might not agree, we might differ on various things, and that's fine. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give people the rights that they deserve.
Thank you. Toda rabba. Thank you, Maayan, and thank you, Rabbi Mikey. Gary, are there any questions from our friends here? Anyone have a question for the rabbinical student or the rabbi?
If you're willing to. Sorry, I think it's perfectly fine. If you would like to field the questions, that would be fine. I can do it if you would like. But you simply,
well, if anyone has a question, you can unmute yourself. If not, well, we'll give you a second. Yeah, Alba from
Alba.
Yeah.
Hi. I understand what gay means. I understand what lesbian means. I understand what trans means. I don't understand the word queer. Does it have a special connotation, or is it a global connotation? And why would it exist if already words like lesbian and gay exist? What does queer mean?
Maayan, do you have an answer for that?
Anybody?
Or Mikey?
It's very much a generational thing in part, which is what so Mikey and I might have different answers. Because in queer was very much once a slur that was used against LGBT people, which has been reclaimed in a way. I would say it functioned today, at least among people 30 and under is who I feel comfortable speaking for in that way. It's both an umbrella term, and also it means that you don't necessarily have to commit. Some people, they're like, am I bisexual? Am I gay? I don't really know, but I know that I'm in this direction, that this community is my community. Or maybe it's also provides like an umbrella for people who are like questioning their gender. They're like, maybe they're not totally sure if they're lesbian, if they're trans and straight. It's a way of grouping together all those different kinds of people without requiring such specific definitions.
Yeah. Mikey?
Is there an equivalent kind of term in Hebrew that has that same kind of catch-all flavor?
Yeah.
How does this translate into Israeli language?
Kvir.
And people also would say like they're like me'akeila, just like from the community, which also sort of has this sort of general.
Yes. If you say hakehila, the community, it's a euphemism for the LGBT community. A lot of straight people still have difficulty in saying the words gay and lesbian and bi and trans and queer, etc. And then that's a phenomenon around the world, because for so many years it was drilled into our brains that these are not positive terms, and therefore it's just easier to use a generalization. But going back to the word queer, that it's also a type of a political, or has a political side and an academic side to it. There's queer theory that you can study at universities today. It tends to be, I don't like it very much, perhaps because I'm older as well, and queer was still very much a slur for people like me growing up. But queer theory is very, very far left wing in general, to my opinion anyway, and it tends to be very radical, and it talks about we don't need marriage at all. It's like, why, parts of the queer theory people, whatever, they talk about, we don't want marriage at all. We don't want the state to be able to be involved in that. It's like, we should be able to live however we want to and define ourselves however we want to. Whilst I might agree with some of that, I don't agree with all. So, there is a monthly, well, not at the moment because of Corona, but there's a monthly get together in some pub here in Rehovot called Queer Ba'ir, queer in the city, so so it gets translated as not translated, just using the same word.
I have another question. The Purim Gay Parade. How has Tel Aviv society taken the Purim Parade and see it metamorphose into the Queer Purim Parade? Oh, Gay Pride Day. I'm not too sure. I'm not sure. I'm using words, but I'm not sure that I'm using them correctly.
I didn't know there's a connection between the parades. Maybe Mayan, you know about the connection between Purim Parade and Gay Parade. I think they're all maybe in a similar time of year, but as far as I know, I don't think there is a direct connection between.
I don't think there's a direct connection, and it is the spirit of the Tel Aviv Pride Parade can feel very similar to the spirit of Purim. Sometimes, like, there's a lot of dressing up, and in costume, not necessarily in costumes, but it's more kind of like dressing to make a statement about, this is something I wouldn't feel comfortable wearing in the streets on a normal day, even if it might be an expression of my gender. So I also think that there a lot of queer LGBT Jews throughout history have really identified with Purim as a holiday because it involves that the whole idea of putting on a mask, showing something different to the outside, while you're in your heart, you're something else. I think it kind of, like, everything about costuming sort of appeals to certain types of queer LGBT narratives. And on a practical level, I will say, so I think it's more subconscious than at the very deep, like, conscious level. But people do call it like Chag HaGeava, like the Pride Chag, the Pride holiday. It has sort of taken on this really holiday. It functions in some ways sort of like a Jewish holiday. Like, there is Erev Chag HaGeava, like, what are you doing the night before the Pride Parade? It's there's certainly influences of Jewish culture in the way that it's talked about.
I only bring that up because in San Francisco, there's definitely a connection between Halloween. There's the there's the Pride Day, which is a completely different day, but Halloween in San Francisco is really quite something. And it's kind of fun to watch, actually.
The aspect of costume.
The costuming is incredible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. And that there seems to be that connection, between Halloween and Gay Pride. But then the Pride Day is a completely different day. Right. But just Halloween seems to be connected, and I was thinking maybe Purim had this connection, which you've explained quite nicely.
It reminds me of in Sydney, in Australia, they celebrate Mardi Gras, right, during February, and that has become a very gay thing as well. And this whole thing of dressing up, because I mean, less so today, but like, let's say when I was younger, I was dressing up as a straight man all the time, and then I could let go on Purim or at Mardi Gras or wherever it might be, Halloween, etc. And so I think that makes the connection. And there's no doubt that, you know, it's well known that you know, I might be gay, but I don't dress up well. But it is well known that a lot of gay people do like to dress up. You know, in my shul, I'm like the worst. I just put on a Batman hat or something like that for Purim. But, you know, I'd probably be thrown out of the gay community because of that. But but yeah, this thing about dressing up, and so suddenly you can be yourself. And my cat has joined us.
Gary, yes.
You mentioned resistance in the ultra-Orthodox community on a few occasions, but of course they must have their own gay subsets, and I wonder, is that just completely hidden, or is there any outreach to them?
So there's certainly outreach, but let's understand certainly the Hasidic communities are the most closed communities there are in this country, and there are some bad stories as well that come out of that. But generally, these kids have got no outlet now. In Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Open House has done as much outreach as it can, but it's very limited because it can't get in to these closed societies. And it's really only once the kids start looking out and finding out that there's a wonderful story that I was told by one of the parents who used to volunteer at the open house. They used to have this type of a couple hours a week where a parent would sit there and anyone could come in or call up and just speak to a parent of gay and lesbian kids. And this Hasidic guy, I think, called up, and this woman was there, a mother of someone at the open house, and he was like saying, and there's no one else like me, and what am I going to do? And so she said, and this was like, I think it was like 18, 19, and she said to the kid, do you ever talk about girls? And he was like, no, we're not allowed to talk about girls. It's like, you know, in the yeshiva or whatever. I said, yeah, but sometimes, you know, in the evening when you're all, yeah, sometimes we do. And what do you feel when they talk about that? I zone out. So she said to him, look to see if there's any other guy who's zoning out like you do. And then you might find someone who has similar feelings to you as well. You know, whatever the percentage might be of gay and lesbians in the population, is exactly the same in every community, give or take, you know, a few, you know, tenths of a percent here or there. And for most of them, it means they have to leave the community, which is very sad. It's like, at least nowadays in the modern Orthodox community, I had an intern a couple years ago who finished at Schechter 2 years ago now. And he comes from a place in Judea and Samaria, right, from a West Bank town, where they're obviously very right-wing, etc. They're all Orthodox there, but modern Orthodox. And he can still go there with his partner. They can go for Shabbat, and you know, they still they can go to shul together and whatever. It's like they won't be honored as a couple, but you know, they're still part of the community. So, you know, it's very difficult when you're in a closed community of whatever type, and obviously there's also the Muslim communities as well, which are very, very close to this subject as well. So, you know, there's outreach that is there, but it's very difficult to get in.
I would just add that it's an interesting phenomenon that I became familiar with over the past few years, that very oftentimes like young Orthodox people will come to Israel after high school to study in a yeshiva or seminary for a year. And including like from these like Haredi, Hasidic, ultra Orthodox communities, and for LGBT kids from those communities, the opportunity to be, they're still sort of like within that world, except for that world in Israel, but stepping outside of the very tight bubble that they grew up in, for a lot of them becomes sort of a way for them to explore what it would be like outside that bubble. And a lot of them end up I've met a couple who were thrown out of yeshiva because of their LGBT identity, and a lot of them, they make up not a small proportion of the homeless youth in Jerusalem are LGBT kids from those kinds of backgrounds.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of what you shared today. I want to be conscious for the time, also of yours and also of our speakers. Rabbi Rafi, I'm not sure if you're still with us or you're with Jonah. I saw he was on you beforehand, but I first want to say Mazal Tov to Rabbi Rafi, if he does hear us, for the birth of Jonah, and want to thank you all for inviting us, not only today, but for the last couple months, meeting with you on these Sundays and sharing with you, yes, some of the struggles, but also I think an optimistic look about the future, and also this shared feeling that we're not alone, but this is a struggle that we do together amongst us here in Israel and within activists and different Masorti communities, but also with you that we see as our friends and partners in the States. So thank you so much. And I would say that I'm looking forward to meeting you face to face after, the coronas has invited us to, into your living rooms and into your offices. But I know, Rabbi Mikey, I'm sure you have an open invitation to your synagogue in Rehovot and here in Jerusalem, in the headquarters of the Masorti movement. We look forward to welcoming you here in Israel and continue this conversation. And Bemet, thank you so much for having us for the last, I want to say 3 weeks or 3 Sundays. Toda rabba.
From our perspective too, let me thank you guys for 3 excellent programs that you've given us. I'm so sorry to have had this late state. If it makes you feel any better, we have recorded the program and we will make it available to anyone who thought that somehow it was canceled. Well, I guess I won't say anything about upstate New York. I'll skip that. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Toda rabba.
And I hope we will get to see you again.
Toda.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Hey, Stephen Schmidt, before you leave, turn on your video. Are we on deck at the Enterprise here?
That is exactly what it is, yes. And it's become a very good generational screen. There's an age over which everybody recognizes what it is, below which almost nobody does.
Exactly. I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, I know this set. I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, just wanted to say hi.
Hello, good to see you. You're in Valencia, Spain.
Yeah, I am in Valencia, Spain. And
Cool.
in fact, I've used to come, until my schedule kind of changed, to the morning Shecharit get-togethers on Tuesday, I think it was. And I think I've got this right. And after the morning Shecharit, there was a half-hour get-together to talk about some part of the morning service, where it came from, what the evolution of it was. And what's the name of the rabbi who does that? Really, Abraham, maybe? No, I don't know. I can't remember his name.
I don't know.
Am I in the right shul? Am I thinking the right thing?
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
think that's us because well, we are holding Shakrit Minyan on Tuesday morning now. I think that's one of the ones that we share with another, we'd meet jointly with another synagogue, and it might be the rabbi from the other synagogue that
It
does that.
might be that. I don't know, but I really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, they're fun to
And
do.
it was
Yeah.
like at the beginning of the COVID experience, you know, like in March, April, May, June is when I did it. And then my schedule kind of changed and I'm doing something else because of the hour change and stuff. But I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed it. And I really like every now and again popping into some of the activities that Agudat Ahim offers. They're very good.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Hope we'll
welcome.
see more of them.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye.